Many bombers employed by the combatants during World War II became famous, but very few became legendary. A great aircraft needed a quality which cannot be installed on the drawing board or in the factory. A truly great aircraft must have that touch of genius which transcends the good, and above all, it must have a great deal of luck. The luck to be in the right place at the right time. It must have flying qualities well above the average, reliability, ruggedness, and fighting ability. And in the final analysis, it needs the skilled touch of its air crews to which it has endeared itself. All these things and more, the Avro Lancaster had in good measure. Despite its power-operated turrets, those abominations which plagued the wartime bomber designers striving for cleanliness of line, the Lancaster embodied a measure of grace which actually made it pleasing on the eye. Its neat aerodynamic shape contributed materially towards its excellent all-round performance. But like so many good aeroplanes, the essence of its design was its simplicity, its robust structure being ideally suited for mass production, and this was undoubtedly one of the main features for its success. It was also remarkably adaptable and a superlative bomber on every count. At first, using 4,000-pound bombs and smaller weapons, the Lancaster carried the war into the heart of Germany. It wasn't long, however, before it became the major offensive weapon of the RAF. By April 1942, it was carrying the 8,000-pound bomb, and by 1943, it had progressed to the 12,000-pounder. In the early days, navigation was largely by dead reckoning, and bomb aiming was entirely visual. Gradually, radar navigational aids such as Rebecca, G, and Oboe became available, and the H-2S radar bombing equipment, with its distinctive semi-opaque blister beneath the rear fuselage, became a standard fitting. The most remarkable offensive weapon to be used by the Lancaster was, perhaps, the bouncing bomb, which was to be used on one of the Lancaster's most spectacular and daring raids. It was dropped by the immortal 617 Squadron on the strategically important Mona, Ada, and Sorpé dams in the Ruhr.
Somewhere about that wooded patch at 12 o'clock. There's something fucking obscure. Some little village on a road.
Wartime commander of Bomber Command, Sir Arthur Harris, heralded the Lancaster as the finest bomber of the war, and added, its efficiency was almost incredible, both in performance and in the way it could be saddled with ever-increasing bomb loads without breaking the camel's back. The Lancaster far surpassed all other types of heavy bomber. Not only could it take heavier loads, it was also easier to handle, and, far more important to the crews, the casualty rate was also consistently lower than the others. Of all those great aeroplanes which fought out the war, there are many people who would insist that the Avro Lancaster was the greatest. The Whitley was the mainstay of the RAF bomber force for the first 2 years, in which the seeds of strategic night bombing were being sown. Although one of the least appealing bombers of the war, the Whitley did represent an important landmark in the history of the RAF's offensive capability. Few, if any, bombers of the Second World War enjoyed a longer or more distinguished operational career than the Vickers Wellington. Blooded in combat at the very outset of hostilities, it carried the lion's share of RAF Bomber Command's night bombing offensive until the operational debut of the 4-engine heavies, and it was still in the front line when the war ended. Indeed, such was the brilliant battle record of the Wellington that any tribute can be but a pale reflection of the distinctions that this remarkable warplane won for itself. The Wellington's docility, combined with a lively performance and the ability to absorb an outstanding amount of battle damage, rapidly endeared it to its crews, and its portly, well-fed appearance engendered the nickname Wimpy, after the strip cartoon character. More than any other bomber, the Wellington proved the power-operated gun turret to be a formidable defensive weapon. But it disproved the widely held belief that large bombers could undertake daylight bombing raids against heavily defended targets without fighter escort. Like most successful combat aircraft, the Wellington was a result of teamwork, but it undoubtedly owed its success to the revolutionary geodetic or basket weave system of construction. This was an ingenious idea by Barnes Wallis, and even more remarkable because of its essential simplicity. Before the end of 1939, the Wellington was to achieve one doubtful distinction. It was to teach the RAF the hard lesson that the operation of such large aircraft by daylight without fighter escort was impractical. This lesson was driven home when 10 Wellingtons were lost and 3 badly damaged, out of a formation of 24, making an armed reconnaissance raid on Wilhelmshaven and the Schillig Roads. The Wellington was from then on never again used by daylight unescorted, except in coastal and transport commands. With its transfer to a nighttime bombing role, the Wellington operated with conspicuous success, spearheading the RAF's night offensive against Germany. The Wellington was an aeroplane worthy of the Royal Air Force. It bore with distinction the name of a great British soldier. Other bombers came forward as the war progressed, but none enjoyed a finer reputation. When, in the summer of 1936, the Bristol Blenheim made its debut, it was immediately hailed as a major step forward in combat aircraft design, which placed the British aircraft industry in the forefront of fast day bomber development. It was the first modern all-metal cantilever monoplane of stress skin construction to be placed in production for the Royal Air Force, and, as such, it denoted the beginning of a new era in the equipment of that air arm. For several years, acute uneasiness had existed concerning the obsolescence of the RAF's operational equipment, uneasiness accentuated by developments abroad. The emergence of the Blenheim, representing such a tremendous technical advance over the aircraft which it superseded, did much to still this disquiet. More than any other aeroplane, it sounded the death knell of the fighting biplane. It set a pattern in the light bomber design which other nations were not slow to follow, yet the Blenheim was fated never to fulfill the very high hopes that were placed in it. One of the key types selected by the Air Ministry for the re-equipment of the rapidly expanding RAF of the late 30s, the Blenheim, at the time of its service introduction, was possessed of a performance which enabled it to outpace most contemporary service fighters. Yet such was the pace of combat aircraft evolution during those last 2 years of peace in Europe, that when the RAF went to war in September 1939, it soon discovered that the Blenheim was not the redoubtable weapon that it had supposed. Its shortcomings soon manifested themselves in the hard school of aerial combat. It was to prove woefully vulnerable to fighter attack. It was to be found deficient in both defensive armament and armor. Nevertheless, it was to bear the brunt of much of the fighting on every front to which the RAF was committed for the first 3 years of the Second World War. Despite its limitations, it was to serve valorously. A parallel might be drawn between the Blenheim and the Curtiss P-40. Like the American fighter, it was praised and abused, lauded and vilified, but it was all that was available, and however divergent were views of the effectiveness of the Blenheim as a weapon, it was one of the truly historic aircraft of the war. The short Stirling was not merely the first of the Royal Air Force true heavies of the Second World War. It was the only British four-engine bomber, designed from the outset to take 4 power plants, to see operational service during the conflict. The Lancaster and Halifax having both stemmed from twin-engine designs. Carrying bomb loads far greater than any previously contemplated, the Stirling proved one of the most important landmarks in the history of the RAF. Yet the official history of the RAF in the Second World War was to refer to the Stirling as a disappointment. In consequence, its career as a first-line heavy bomber was relatively brief. Nevertheless, as the RAF's first 4-engine heavy of the Second World War, the Stirling occupied a particularly important place in the history of that air arm. The Avro Manchester, the predecessor of the Lancaster, was not a successful bomber. It proved to be unreliable and underpowered. Only 209 were built, and production of the type lasted barely a year. The Handley-Page Halifax, after some initial teething problems, did develop into an outstanding aircraft. Remaining in service until the end of the war, the Halifax maintained its position of one of the 2 principal RAF heavy bombers. The Hampden was one of the world's most advanced warplanes at the time of its debut, and it came of a distinguished line. It was a forgiving aeroplane from the pilot's viewpoint, and its ease of control rendered it an extremely pleasant airplane to fly. It was small enough to be highly maneuverable, its cockpit offered an excellent fighter-like field of vision, and it possessed a remarkable speed range. Named after William Mitchell, the far-sighted crusading American colonel of the 20s, who was court-martialed for his outspoken views on air power and posthumously raised to the rank of brigadier general, the North American B-25 was possibly the best all-round light-medium bomber of the Second World War. Operationally efficient, this docile, adaptable machine had an excellent all-round performance, and with particularly good handling characteristics, and it was one of the most popular of combat aircraft among all Allied air crews. Had the Mitchell never attacked another objective, it would have ranked among the most truly historic aircraft of the war for its fantastic attack against Tokyo in 1942, when it operated from the flight deck of the USS Hornet. It was manufactured in larger quantities than any other American twin-engine bomber, no less than 9,816 Mitchells being accepted by the USAAF, although many of these were destined to find their way to the British, Soviet, and other Allied air forces. The peak number of Mitchells in the USAAF service never exceeded 2,656 aircraft, but this exceptionally fine bomber made its mark on every far-flung front of the Second World War. One of the select band of Allied aircraft that could claim to have been engaged on every major battlefront of the Second World War, the Mitchell built up an unrivaled tradition of service. There can be few more dramatic examples of the consistent development of a basic design under the exigencies of war than that offered by this remarkable aircraft, which was destined to linger on in the service of many of the world's air arms far into the post-war era.
Watch out for fighters. Keep your eye on them, Bill. See any parachutes, Quinlan? Parachutes so black at 9 o'clock.
8 men still in that B-17. Come on, the rest of you guys. Get out of there.
Come on, Bill.
So far, 3 more shoots. Flash, 11 o'clock. Fighters, 6
ME-109 at 3 o'clock.
Keep that.
Few other aircraft of the Second World War gained the universal affection of their aircrew over so long an operational period, as did the Boeing B-17 Fortress. This legendary aircraft formed the spearhead of the American bombing offensive in Europe, from beginning to end, as well as serving in every other theater of war. No single aircraft type contributed more to the defeat of the Luftwaffe, both in the air and on the ground, than the Fortress, which enabled tangible expression to be given to the controversial United States policy for the strategic assault of Germany by day in the face of formidable political argument as well as desperate enemy opposition. A curious feature of the Fortress's history is that its reputation as the leading Allied day bomber was established, despite its inferiority in many respects of performance, compared with its combat contemporary, the B-24 Liberator. The bomb load of USA AF Fortresses over Europe was usually no more than carried by the diminutive de Havilland Mosquito. Far fewer fortresses than Liberators were built, 12,677 fortresses being accepted by the USA AF between July 1940 and August 1945. These equipped a maximum of 33 overseas combat groups by August 1944. The Fortress achieved fame on the strength of several outstanding attributes. Of these, perhaps the most important were an excellent high-altitude capability and the ability to absorb an amazing amount of battle damage. To these attributes were added in its later variants an exceptionally heavy defensive armament, though the true combat potential of the Fortress was achieved only after a long period of gestation. The Fortress had dropped over 640,000 tons of bombs on European targets during the war years. This compares with 452,508 tons dropped by the B-24 Liberators and 463,544 tons dropped by all other aircraft. According to records compiled by its manufacturers, the Fortress destroyed 23 enemy aircraft per 1,000 sorties, as compared to 11 by B-24 Liberators, 11 by United States fighters, and 3 by all United States light and medium bombers. Although it has been established that the very high claims of enemy aircraft kills scored by the Fortress were greatly exaggerated, there can be no doubt that the total was formidable. By its almost unrivaled period of first-line service, the Fortress proved itself one of the classic bomber designs of all time. Its performance proved a triumphant vindication of the principles of air strategy and bomber design established by a few far-sighted airmen and engineers in the United States of America long before World War II. While the Boeing Superfortress gained for itself undying fame as the first aircraft to drop an atomic weapon, thus bringing about the sudden termination of hostilities in the Pacific, it is also deserving of a place in the history of aircraft warfare as one of the principal Allied weapons in the war against Japan. The laborious and costly island-hopping campaign conducted in the Pacific by the Allied forces was undertaken largely to seize bases for Superfortress operations against the Japanese homeland. Once bases had been established, the Superfortresses of the United States 20th Air Force systematically and inexorably erased the industrial cities of Japan one by one with the terrible weapon of fire. The closely packed and lightly constructed Japanese buildings were extremely vulnerable to incendiary attacks, and the destruction wreaked by Superfortresses in some built-up areas amounted to as much as 99.5%. In addition to these devastating blows against strategic targets, the Superfortresses were simultaneously employed on a highly successful campaign of mine-laying in Japanese home waters, thereby applying an economic and logistic stranglehold to the islands of Nippon. The delivery of the 2 atomic bombs against Hiroshima and Nagasaki was, therefore, in the nature of a coup de grace, although essential to shorten the war. The Superfortress was largely responsible for the final defeat and surrender of Japan without invasion, and the instrument which provided the ultimate vindication of the American visionaries of strategic air power. The Superfortresses made an immense contribution to subsequent bomber design. It was the Second World War's heaviest production warplane, and the first pressurized aircraft to attain large-scale production. It was also the first to make extensive use of remotely controlled armament. But perhaps the most remarkable feature of its history was the fact that it was designed, built, tested, and placed in operational service within 4 years. Although each type had its staunch adherents, the consolidated Liberator was somewhat overshadowed in fame, if not in achievement, by the Boeing Fortress during the Second World War. This was despite the fact that not only was the Liberator built in considerably larger numbers than the Fortress, it was produced in greater quantities than any other American aircraft. Such a unique production record is all the more remarkable for such a large 4-engine aircraft, and the Liberator operated over more fronts for a considerably longer period and was produced in a greater variety of versions than any other Allied or enemy bomber. By comparison with the Fortress, the Liberator was indeed an ugly duckling. Its deep, slab-sided fuselage and immense barn door-like vertical tail surfaces were features hardly indicative of speed and agility. One of the prime virtues of the Liberator, and one which invariably hallmarks a great warplane, was its versatility. In addition to strategic bombing, it was used with equal facility for maritime reconnaissance and anti-submarine operations, passenger and freight transportation, as a fly-air tanker, and for photographic reconnaissance, as well as for many other duties. It was this quality, in fact, which largely accounted for the extraordinary total of 18,188 Liberators and Liberator variants constructed by the USAAF between delivery of the first production aircraft in June 1941 and the closing down of the last assembly line on the 31st of May 1945. Apart from its unchallenged production record, the Liberator earned for itself a permanent place in aviation history for its remarkable record of achievement. Whether the material to be delivered happened to be bombs, depth charges, gasoline, freight, troops, or VIPs, the Liberator established a reputation second to none for doing almost any job, anywhere. In some respects, the combat career of the Douglas A-20 was much less spectacular than that of other bombers employed by the combatants. It was associated with no outstanding operations, but remained in frontline service throughout the war. It did not distinguish itself on any particular battlefront, but flew with equal distinction over all of them. It did as well in Russia as it did in the Pacific or the Western Desert, and withal was one of the most pleasant of all combat aircraft to fly. Designated by the Americans as the Havoc and by the British as the Boston, the A-20 was a pilot's aeroplane, and its virtues were sworn in a variety of languages ranging from Afrikaans to French and from British to Ukrainian, as well as being operated by the Americans and Australians. Its cosmopolitan nature was fundamental in its design, however, for it owed its origins much to the Spanish Civil War, and subsequently to the urgent need for rearmament by the French. The danger signals of 1936 had not been ignored in the United States, and prominent aircraft manufacturers were considering the future possible requirements for the United States Army Corps well in advance of any military specifications being issued. Well suited to the low-level bomber role, the Bostons, or Havocs, were adaptable, reliable, tractable, and extremely potent. Possibly overshadowed throughout much of its career by the more spectacular exploits which fell to the lot of other bombers, the A-20 did rank highly amongst the most brilliant combat aircraft designs evolved by the United States aircraft industry. No combat aircraft of the Second World War, either from the Axis or Allied powers, was the subject of so much modification and extemporization as was the Junkers Ju-88. Operating in various forms throughout the entire period of the European War, and still in production when the hostilities ceased, the Ju-88 was the true backbone of the Luftwaffe. This bomber was produced in greater numbers than all of the other German bombers combined, some 15,000 being built between 1939 and 1945. The Ju-88 was continuously adapted to perform roles other than that for which it had been conceived, and performed every task demanded of it with distinction. Like all combat aircraft, it possessed its share of shortcomings. These were largely due to changes dictated by the needs of the overstrained and depleted German defenses during the war's closing stages. Without doubt, despite its shortcomings, the Ju-88 was the finest German bomber to see extensive operational service. This aircraft was conceived as a result of a meeting held in 1935 between high-ranking officers of the then fledgling Luftwaffe and chief German aircraft designers. They were informed of the requirement for a Schnellbomber, meaning a medium bomber with the speed of a fighter. Junkers were finally awarded the contract, the prototype making its maiden flight in 1936. From the outset of war, the Ju-88 flourished to serve on every front and in almost every role. And apart from its use as a medium bomber, it also served as a night fighter, reconnaissance, torpedo bomber, mine layer, and finally as the lower half of the Mistel flying bomb. Highly regarded by the Allies, the Ju-88 was considered to exemplify the German philosophy of using one good basic airframe for a multitude of tasks, rather than evolving a variety of specialized machines, and thus complicating production. It is true to say that had the Ju-88 proved less amenable to the process of adaptation and modification to which it was eventually submitted, then the Luftwaffe would have found itself in serious difficulties at a very much earlier stage in the Second World War. Few were the inhabitants of England's capital and southern counties to whom, in the dramatic months of 1940, the distinctive and disagreeable note of the Heinkel HE 111's engine was unfamiliar. For this machine, the first modern medium bomber to be acquired by the Luftwaffe, bore the major burden of the German bombing offensive against the British Isles during the main phase of the Battle of Britain. Despite its shortcomings, which became more marked as the war progressed, and which were in no small part due to the continual process of modification and extemporization to which the bomber was subjected, the HE 111 retained its place as the standard Luftwaffe combat aircraft throughout the war. Produced in large numbers, this aircraft was twice taken out of mass production, only to be returned to the production lines when the new types with which it was to be replaced failed to materialize. During the opening phases of the war, the Heinkel HE 111 was undoubtedly a formidable offensive weapon, an elegant, well-built, well-planned aircraft with good flying characteristics. It was certainly a thoroughbred, inheriting its shapely contours from its single-engine predecessor, the HE 70 Blitz, which at the time of its appearance had been justifiably acclaimed as the most aerodynamically efficient aeroplane ever to have flown. Like many German warplanes of its era, the HE 111 had first been shown to the world as a civil aircraft, but its sleek, streamlined fuselage was obviously designed for maximum performance at the expense of passenger comfort. However, intended from its birth as one of the Luftwaffe's principal weapons of the future Blitzkrieg, the HE 111 had placed Germany at the forefront of medium bomber development. It was, however, forced to soldier on long past its allotted span, owing to the inability of the German aircraft industry to produce a suitable replacement, and was already approaching obsolescence when called upon to carry the major burden of the Luftwaffe's bombing offensive against the British Isles. Despite continual improvements, it could not keep pace with the rapidly changing requirements of air warfare, and during the last years of the war was no longer the formidable weapon with which the Luftwaffe had attacked Poland. One design that did manage to see production was the Junkers Ju-188, a twin-engine medium bomber which first saw action in 1942. As early as 1939, Junkers had been working on the Ju-288, which was a completely new design far more advanced than preceding types. But when it became apparent that the design, which should meet a specification which called for the type to be in service by 1942, was not going to be developed in time, the Luftwaffe proposed that instead, the Ju-88 should be modified to meet the new requirement. Hence, in the interim, the Ju-188 was born. In principle, Junkers took the forward fuselage section of the Ju-88 and added a new wing and a new tail unit. This new design was designated originally as the Ju-88E, but this was later changed to the Ju-188E. The first aircraft left the factory in June 1942 for operational use as a dive bomber. However, with the increased defenses of the Allied forces, it was not particularly successful. Its role was changed to that of a medium horizontal bomber, and also as a torpedo bomber for attacking shipping in the Atlantic. Further developments took the Ju-188 into the night fighter role for defending Germany's homeland against the increasing Allied strategic bombing campaign. In order to achieve greater speed and altitude, without the disruption caused by the introduction of a completely new design, the Ju-188 was also developed into a high-altitude bomber with a pressurized cockpit section. This type later became designated as the Ju-388. In 1944, the role of the Ju-188 was changed again when it was used in the Pathfinder role during the year's bombing campaign against England. Operating from 1942 until the end of the war, seeing action in Europe and on the Mediterranean, Arctic and Eastern Front, the Ju-188 in its variety of roles was among the most important of the Luftwaffe's operational aircraft. Bomben auf England, so read the title of a stirring martial song which blared out of loudspeakers all over Germany and the occupied territories during the autumn months of 1940. With the accompaniment of roaring aero engines and the beating of drums, it was an impressive battle hymn. But whatever its psychological effect on the German populace may have been, it was hardly destined to raise the spirits of the personnel of the Luftwaffe. They were fully aware that their bombers did not have the range to attack effectively more than a small area of the British Isles. They knew that the Luftwaffe's lack of a long-range strategic bomber enabled the RAF to concentrate virtually the whole of its defensive strength within a limited area, an area to which the Luftwaffe was forced to confine its attentions. They also knew that this would sap their operational strength. Prototypes of four-engine heavies had been built, but they were abandoned and never saw the production lines. They did, however, possess the Heinkel HE 177 Greif, a long-range twin-engine bomber, an aircraft which was destined to provide the most dismal chapter in the wartime record of the German aircraft industry. Fires in the air, aerodynamic troubles, and structural failures all contributed towards the unpopularity of this big bomber when it reached operational units. The faults of this aircraft were recognized too late, and when they were recognized, insufficient energy was devoted to eradicating them. There was nothing wrong with the basic design, and, had effective measures been taken, the Luftwaffe might have found itself possessing a heavy bomber comparable with, if not superior to, the best of the Allied machines of the same type. Aptly named the Greif, this aircraft's chief claim to fame was the fact that it was the only German heavy bomber to attain quantity production during the war years. It was, in fact, one of the very few entirely new German combat aircraft to progress from the design boards to operational service during the conflict. But the advantages that it offered were nullified by the German aircraft industry's inability to devote sufficient effort towards its perfection. Acclaimed by German propagandists as the scourge of Europe, the aircraft that conquered nations, the supreme weapon, the angularly ugly Junkers Ju-87 dive bomber attained greater notoriety than any other weapon in the arsenal with which Germany launched the Second World War. It was one of the most vulnerable of warplanes, slow, unwieldy, and the natural prey of the fighter. Yet within the first 9 months of the war, it had acquired an almost legendary reputation. The German air staff itself was divided on the subject of dive bombing and the employment of the Ju-87, but the Polish campaign appeared to vindicate its protagonists. The Ju-87 knocking out strong points, artillery batteries and concentrations whenever the Polish sought to make a stand. When the German offensive against France and the Low Countries opened in May 1940, the Ju-87 repeated its earlier successes, blasting the Allied armor and defenses, paralyzing whole armies, playing havoc with communications in vital rear areas, and hounding the streams of refugees. With virtually no aerial opposition, the Ju-87 was fully able to exploit the accuracy of bomb aiming inherent in the steep dive, as well as the demoralizing effect on personnel exposed to this form of attack. But the use of the Ju-87 presumed control of the air, and the issue was settled in the Battle of Britain when, after a few abortive sorties by Ju-87s during which their formations were decimated by opposing Hurricanes and Spitfires, the dive bombers were withdrawn from the Cherbourg area, and the Ju-87's career had entered the eclipse. The Ju-87 was aerodynamically an atrocity. It was ugly to the point of absurdity, and it was virtually defenseless against the modern fighter. Yet its distinctive shape was the most feared by Germany's opponents, and this one aircraft type revolutionized the very fundamentals of warfare.